At the time of Abraham and Melchizedek, Salem, that's Jerusalem, was still a city of Ham, not of God's name Shem. Therefore, Melchizedek couldn't have then been king of Salem, as this is an anachronism, like Abraham being called the Hebrew in Genesis 14. The first time Jerusalem is recognized for having a literal king was when Adonizedek, a Canaanite who was a wicked king of Jerusalem, mentioned in Joshua 10, who was executed for his wickedness. Therefore, Melchizedek in Genesis 14 couldn't have at that time been king of Jerusalem. It was an anachronism for Jerusalem finally being recognized as a city of God, which had the name given it by Shem, which is the name of God, not Ham, which led to the Canaanites, which were enemies of Shem and enemies of God's name and enemies of Israel. And King David, who was king of Jerusalem, being associated as the city of the Lord in its rightful hands under Shem, Melchizedek was a king who was an anachronism for being associated with the Shemite heavenly city called Jerusalem. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem, it says in the Psalms, city of Judah and city of King David, city of Shem, heavenly city of God, as said in the book of Revelation in the New Testament. Melchizedek in Hebrew means king of righteousness and is referring to King Bera, king of wicked city Sodom. Abraham noticed he was righteous, though, and that Jerusalem was God's city, not a Canaanite city of Ham, which it was at the time. King Bera may have himself been a Shemite and originated in Mesopotamia with the kings near King Chedorlaomer, who was defeated by Abraham, who was also a Shemite, and later became king of wicked Hamite city Sodom, did King Bera, where he died with the wicked city, even though Abraham recognized him as an eternal high priest of righteousness of the Lord. A Shemite Melchizedek, an anachronism for king of Jerusalem. I know it might seem odd that Chedorlaomer was defeated by Abraham being a Shemite, but Shemites and Abraham was a Shemite, but there were disagreements even between the Shemites. And there are disagreements today among the Jews in Israel. But there are very important points to note that Jerusalem and Melchizedek would have had to be king of Jerusalem being a Shemite, not a Hamite, not of Ham, not of Canaan. People who say Melchizedek was the Lord do not read the Bible as a Jewish Hebrew person in Israel today does, who understands the Bible and the Old Testament, because the Old Testament is fully logical and makes sense. And Melchizedek was not a ghost of God, the ghost being the Lord, like some Christians say he was, because the Old Testament didn't have specters and ghosts. It was talked about kings who were real literal people and logically described within the chapter. It's not metaphorical, the Old Testament, like the New Testament, though it does contain anachronisms. And that's because the Word of God is not linear or chronological in terms of its laws and precepts. Even Jewish people recognized that the law of Moses still applied at the time of Cain and Abel, but the people then disobeyed that and called it dispensationalism, which is saying God does different things and acts differently at different times in history. Dispensationalism is a sin. Even dispensationalist churches. God is always the same throughout history and does not act in different ways at different seasons. And the last days in the book of Revelation is only a metaphor for dealing with God's ways in times when people have erred. Now I'm going to read Genesis chapter 14. And you'll be able to see that Melchizedek was bearer when you read it in the Hebrew. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of El-Asar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. All these were joined together in the vale of Siddim, which is the Salt Sea, which is where Sodom is. That's not in the Bible, but it's if you go to Israel, Sedom is where the Dead Sea is. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. And in the 14th year came Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him, and smote, that's the kings I've just described, and smote the Rephaims in Ashtaroth Karnaim, and the Zurims in Ham, and the Emims in Sheva Kiriath Chaim, and the Horites in their Mount Seir unto Elf Paran, which is by the wilderness. And they returned and came to En Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and smote the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites that dwelt in Hazazon Tamar. And there went out the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Admah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which the same is Zoar, and they joined battle with them in the vale of Siddim. With Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, and with Tidal, king of nations, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings with 5. Notice Melchizedek was not mentioned. And the vale of Siddim was full of slime pits, and the king of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. The king of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there, and then that remained fled to the mountain. And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their victuals, and went their way. And they took Lot, Abraham's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. And there came one that had escaped, and told Abram the Hebrew, and there were no Hebrews at that time, that's an anachronism, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram. And when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. And he divided himself against them, he and his servants, by night, and smote them, and pursued them unto Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot and his goods, and the woman also, and the people. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer, and of the kings that were with him, who I've described, and Melchizedek is not a king mentioned, at the vale of Shaveh, which is the king's dale. Now, verse 18, it's just talked about the king of Sodom in verse 17, Melchizedek. And then in Hebrew, in verse 18, and it says, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine. But Melchizedek means king of righteousness, and it's referring to the king of Sodom in verse 17. So I'll read those two verses again. Verse 17, and the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer, and of the kings that were with him, at the vale of Shaveh, which is the king's dale. Verse 18, and Melchizedek, who was not one of the kings who were with him, it's referring to the king of Sodom in verse 17. Melchizedek means king of righteousness, which is a description for the king of Sodom in verse 17. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, and remember, Salem was Jerusalem and didn't exist at that time. And if it did exist, it was a Hamite city, not a holy city of the name of God of Shem, which is what Melchizedek would have had to have been. So it's an anachronism. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. And he gave him tithes of all. And then verse 21, and then it says, and the king of Sodom said unto Abraham, give me the persons and take the goods to thyself. So you can see it's talking about the same person in verse 20, which was what Melchizedek was saying. And then it refers to him again as the king of Sodom, about giving him back part of the tithe that Abraham's just given him. And 21 again, and the king of Sodom said unto Abraham, give me the persons and take the goods to thyself. And Abraham said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up my hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou should say, I have made Abraham rich. That sounds like what Melchizedek would say, not what Melchizedek would say, not what the king of Sodom would say. But the king of Sodom was recognized by Abraham as being the same person. Melchizedek, the king of Sodom, King Bera. That I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou should say, I have made Abraham rich, save only that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which went with me, Anna, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their portion. And now I want to substantiate that King Bera, king of wicked city Sodom, was in Abraham's eyes Melchizedek, the king of righteousness. Genesis 18 from verse 23. And Abram drew near and said, wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Because he knew that Melchizedek was righteous, because he was King Bera, king of Sodom. Peradventure there be 50 righteous within the city. Wilt thou also destroy and not spare the place for 50 righteous that are therein? That be far from thee to do after this manner, to slay the righteous with the wicked, and that the righteous should be as the wicked. That be far from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? And the Lord said, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes. And Abraham answered and said, behold, now I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord, which am but dust and ashes. Peradventure there shall lack 5 of the 50 righteous. Wilt thou destroy all the city for lack of 5? And he said, if I find there 40 and 5, I will not destroy it. And he spake unto him yet again and said, peradventure there shall be 40 found there. And he said, I will not do it for 40's sake. And he was trying to spare Melchizedek. He was trying to spare King Bera, who Abraham recognized was righteous and decided to pay him a tithe because he could see righteousness in Bera. And he said unto him, O let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Peradventure there shall be 30 found there. And he said, I will not do it if I find 30 there. And he said, behold, now I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord. Peradventure there shall be 20 found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for 20's sake. And he said, oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak yet but this once. Peradventure 10 shall be found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for 10's sake. And the Lord went his way as soon as he had left communing with Abraham. And Abraham returned unto his place. So Sodom was completely wicked. And the Lord said if he could find 10 righteous in the city, he wouldn't destroy it. But Abraham was saying this because he knew Bera was righteous. He was Melchizedek in Abraham's eyes. And he wasn't the king of Sodom. He was the king of Salem, the king of the holy city of Jerusalem, city of Shem, which became the holy city of King David of the Shemites, and the holy heavenly city of God in the book of Revelation. But God couldn't go any lower than 10, and Abraham only found Bera to be righteous in Sodom, and Bera had to die with his wicked city, even though he was the eternal high priest and was really the king of Salem because of his righteousness. And Abraham was called the Hebrew because he recognized that righteousness in Bera and called him Melchizedek.